Hey guys, welcome to game 2 of the 2021 World Chess Championship between Magnus Carlsen and Jan Nepomniachtchi. Like last time, I'm going to be going through the game and looking for those moments where I think we can learn something and get some takeaways that we can apply to our own games. The current score of the match after round 1 is 50-50, so everything is tied up, and Magnus is playing with white in this game. Let's go ahead and get started. So we have d4, knight f6, c4, e6. So if Magnus would have played knight c3, we would have gotten into a Nimzo Indian. Instead, he goes for knight f3. Now, black can still play bishop b4. This is called the Bogo Indian, but it's generally considered, I believe, not to be quite as good because a lot of times one of the benefits of the Nimzo Indian is that this bishop can trade for the knight, and when white recaptures, you get these like weak doubled pawns, which can be a target for black. In the Bogo Indian, white can simply play bishop e2 or knight d2, and you don't really get any pawn structure benefit. So Jan goes with d5 instead, and we've transposed now into a queen's gambit decline. So normally d4, d5, c4, e6, and we could get the same position. We just had a different move order. So g3, bishop e7, doing some standard stuff. And now Jan actually captures the pawn, which, okay, that's kind of a queen's gambit accepted type of thing. Queen to c2, he's threatening to recapture the pawn, and now Jan plays the move b5. This is a pretty rare move because of the fact that it opens up the rook immediately to a discovered attack from the bishop. So that means that Magnus can move this knight wherever he likes and immediately create a threat on the rook. So this is somewhat risky. You have to be very careful if you're going to play this way because there are potentially lots of tactics, and if you're not careful, you can make a mistake. Now that being said, Magnus goes directly for the attack on the rook, and Jan plays c6 to block it. Now, one thing you might be noticing is that this pawn is attacked twice, and it's only defended one time. But it's actually not great if white takes it, because after takes, the rook can just slide over to b8, and black actually has a pretty nice position. These pawns are looking pretty nice. The rook is in a good spot, and black's just going to follow up with bishop d7, move the queen out, bring this rook over, and it really doesn't give black a lot of problems. So that's why Magnus decided to not take the pawn, instead play a4, threatening to take here, because remember this pin means this pawn can't recapture. Okay, so Jan plays knight to d5, blocking the bishop so that now this is defended, and then knight c3, f6. Now, I want to go back just a couple of moves here because this is a really crucial moment, in the game. I want to flip the board for a second. So if you're playing black and you look at this board and you look at all of these squares, do you notice anything special about any of them? Well, the answer should be no. There's nothing really special about that. But as soon as white plays the move a4, one of those squares now has a significant difference to it. Do you know which square it is? Which of these squares now you should be paying attention to? The answer is this b3 square. And you say, why does that matter? Because prior to this a4 move, all of these squares were either protected or attacked, I should say, by a pawn, or they could be attacked by a pawn. Okay, so for example, this is controlled by this pawn. That's not really one, I guess that could be a one, but most of them, like this one, the pawn could come up, okay? This one, the pawn could come up, control this square. The point that I'm trying to make is as soon as a4 is played, b3 is what we would call a hole in chess. It's a square that pawns can no longer take control of. And so those are very, very important, and you're gonna see as the game progresses what I'm talking about. So knight d5, knight c3, the knight goes back, and then e4. Okay, after this move is played, which square should now jump on your radar? Well, the answer is the d3 square, because it was previously defended by this pawn, and now the pawn has been advanced. See, this is the interesting thing about chess. Whenever you move your pawns forward, because of how the rules of chess are, you can never move them back. So if a piece ever ended up here, it's not going to be able to be chased away by a pawn, right? And that is very significant. So what does Jan do immediately? Knight to b4, Magnus moves, knight to d3, okay? And you can see how this is a very annoying knight now because it's defended by the pawn and it can't be chased away, right? So these are the kind of things you want to be looking for in your games. And remember I talked about this b3 square? Watch what happens next. Get a few more moves here. Now watch this knight. Watch this knight very carefully. Look at that. So both of those squares are now, have these monster knights. Now let's flip back again from white's perspective. Let's back up a few moves here. Magnus is looking at a similar thing. He's keeping his eye on this d6 square. Now, at the moment, it's not really defended by a pawn, so it's kind of be hard to actually put a knight there because the queen's guarding it. But watch what he does. He plays knight to e5, and after the capture, now this pawn becomes supporter for the knight on d6, right? So he's doing the same thing, putting his knight on one of those holes deep in enemy territory. Okay, so this is super important, and when you have opportunities to do this in your game, it basically turns this knight into like a rook. You know, a lot of times knights that are deep like this are worth a rook. Okay, so all right, knight b3. Now Nepo decides to make this trade here. Now normally in chess, when you spend a bunch of time moving these knights around like this to get them into good locations, you absolutely do not want to trade them for a piece that's just been sitting on the back rank and hasn't even moved, right? Nepo has played, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4 moves to get this knight to d3, and then where did this knight come from? I think it was like this. Sorry, no, like this, right? 3 moves to get that knight there. So to trade it for a bishop doesn't make a lot of sense in and of itself. Now, the interesting thing here is that he's got a double trade, which means he's not only taking the bishop, but after white recaptures, now he's able to take the rook. So he's winning the exchange by doing that. So that's why he decided to give up those powerful knights, because he actually gets some material back for it. Okay, if it was just a trade of 2 pieces, you wouldn't want to do that, right? But since he's getting the rook, he makes the trade. And that being said, it's not that easy for black because this knight on d6 is still very, very strong, right? So that's kind of the Magnus's compensation for giving up the exchange there. So bishop goes back, bishop to e4, c3. This is a little pawn sacrifice, and Jan is hoping that after takes, his rook becomes much more active, and Magnus decides to throw in this move first, create the little attack on h7, and then he takes, because now he can go ahead and recapture the pawn immediately, and he doesn't lose that extra pawn. Okay, and so pressure on the a7 pawn. But it turns out that after this move, Magnus can't actually take it, because if he tries to take it, you can get something like this: captures, and then there's this nice little trick, rook takes d6. And the point is that you can't retake the rook, or now you lost the defender of your bishop. Remember, the knight was defending the bishop, now it's not. So black just comes out up a piece. And then the other thing that you could try to do would be to like capture here. But then again, black can go check, throw in this check, get the rook out of danger, and then just trade here. And now the rook against the bishop, black is going to win this game. So because of that, Magnus couldn't actually take the pawn on a7. Okay, so we get queen c4. These get traded off. And this knight is still extremely strong. And even though, you know, Magnus is down the exchange, this knight is basically worth a rook. So it's not really that much. Okay, so we get some things here. Magnus puts his king over on h3, very safe from any potential checks or attacks from the rooks or even the queen, because this pawn is kind of blocking the diagonal. So this is a very safe place for the king, as opposed to if it was stuck back here, you'd have to always watch out for things like this, right? So really nice idea to put the king there. And then we kind of get some maneuvering. You know, remember how I said the knight was basically as strong as a rook? And so when Nepo had the chance, he decided totally worth it to give up the rook for the knight and the pawn. And this is pretty common. A lot of times when you're in if you're playing, let's just say, if you're playing as black and you're playing against someone who has a knight defended by a pawn like this, and it's just really in your territory, preventing you from doing a lot of things, a lot of times the best option you have, give up your rook for the knight and the pawn, and that's usually a pretty good trade. So that's what Nepo did. We'll go back to White's point of view here. And we end up with this fairly even endgame, you know, 3 against 3. Magnus does win the pawn, but generally speaking, when you have a position like this, if the queens ever get traded, it's probably going to be a draw. Rook endings like this, where there's only one pawn and everything's on the same side of the board, it's pretty much always a draw if black knows what they're doing. You can look up the Philidor defense. It's a technique that black uses to draw these kind of positions at the end after the pawns get traded. So, you know, if you're interested, look that up. But basically, the only way white could have a chance to win is if queens don't get traded. And so that's exactly what Nepo does. He creates forces the queen trade by playing queen f5. And once we get here, you know, Magnus tried to do some tricks and stuff, but really it was just, you know, a draw all along. So they played a few more moves and eventually get this position. And now they agreed to a draw because after captures, you just get this king and pawn ending that's completely a draw. White can try to push their pawn, but black's just going to go back here, and you would, get something like this, and eventually the pawns would just get traded. So game number 2 ends in a draw. We are tied up, 1 point for each player. So I hope you guys enjoyed this recap. I'll see you in game number 3. As always, stay sharp, play smart, take care.